Welcome to the Period Story Podcast, the podcast where we get behind some of the myths and misconceptions about periods. We chat with women about their period story, their first period, their journey ever since, and we open up a conversation to help break taboos and stigmas around menstruation. I'm your host, Lenise Brothers. I'm a yoga teacher and registered nutritionist specializing in women's health, hormones, and the menstrual cycle. I'm also the author of You Can Have a Better Period, the book Publishers Weekly calls an empowering debut, an informative, refreshing take on women's health. It's available from Amazon, Bookshop, and anywhere else you purchase books. You are in for a real treat. This is such a brilliant episode. I'm so pleased to share my conversation with Katy Ewen. She's a reflexologist and a fertility awareness educator. She so honestly shares her story of the effects her menstrual cycle has had on her mental health and how she's had to navigate OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder, and PMDD, premenstrual dysphoric disorder, and what this means for her in the luteal phase, so the 10 days before her next period starts. Thank you so much for coming on to the show today, Katy. I'm so excited to speak to you.
No, thanks for having me. It's lovely to be here.
So let's get into the first question that I ask all of my guests, which is, tell me the story of your very first period.
So my actual first period was it'll make sense in a second, was like pretty non-eventful. I was like just at home and it started, and like my mum had always had she'd never hidden her tampons or anything. So I always knew what everything was, where it was. She'd been really good with me. So she was like, here's what you need, just make yourself comfortable. And that was it. But I'd had some bleeding. And I say bleeding, it was probably a tiny bit of spotting, maybe a year before. And I was on holiday with my dad and I freaked out. And I was like, I don't know what to do. And I had my stepmom and stepsisters outside the toilet, trying to tell me how to put a tampon in. And I was so I wanted to go swimming. We were on holiday and I was just having a meltdown. And now I'm oh, it was the tiniest bit of spotting. And I thought that was a period. It's kind of funny thinking about that now, but yeah, I'd kind of forgotten that had happened. And I was reminded a little while ago. I was oh yeah, that actually did happen. So yeah, that's quite funny. But
how old were you?
I think I was 12 when I got my first true period, and then I must have been 11 when that happened, and was just freaking out. So it's kind of funny now, but yeah.
So you had that spotting and that kind of adventure with the tampon, and then how long did it take for you to get a so-called true period?
It's hard to remember, but I guess maybe a year or so later. It was a little while later,
right?
But yeah.
So you had that moment with a tampon and the spotting when you were 11, and then you got your period when you were 12. And in between that time, had you been spotting throughout?
Not that I can remember. It is hard to remember, so I'm saying it's a year, but it could have been less. It is really it's still quite hazy now, but not that I recall. I remember when I did get my first true period when I was about 12 and being oh, this is quite different to what I'd experienced before, and being oh, okay, this is what they talk about, rather than the tiny bit of spotting. But as far as I remember, there wasn't anything in between.
Okay. And so how did you know what was going to happen? So had you been receiving education in school? Did your mom have in-depth chats with you about it?
Yeah, we definitely had some stuff at school, but it was pretty minimal from what I can recall. I think it was you're going to have a period, it'll come about once a month, here's a sanitary pad, here's a tampon, and that was it. And then it was just sex education of how not to get pregnant kind of thing. And sitting there at 14 and being well, I'm gay, so none of this applies to me, was also just an interesting experience. But yeah, so we definitely had some stuff at school. And then, as I said, my mum was always pretty open and honest about stuff. She definitely had got some books and things around the house. So we'd read some bits together and stuff. She was actually really, really good with all of it. And it didn't feel like a shock or Like I didn't understand what was going to happen. I mean, outside of my period, I obviously like didn't know anything about the stuff that happens in between one period to the next. But in terms of like getting your period, like, yeah, my mum was pretty like good with all of it. But the school education, I mean, that's another story.
Yeah. And then in terms of your experience of your period, what was the first period like in terms of, and then I guess after into your teenage years, in terms of like, was it painful? Was it just kind of really easy? You know, tell us a little bit more about that.
I never struggled too much with pain as such, maybe some sort of like grumbling cramps, but like that was kind of as bad as the pain got. But I'd always just be exhausted to the point that like even my stepdad would like know when I was on my period, because I'd just be like white as a sheet because I would just be so depleted. So like that was definitely something that I sort of struggled with. I just feel absolutely exhausted when I was on my period. And then going into like my teenage years, definitely. So like I have a long history of struggling with my mental health. So I've got obsessive compulsive disorder, which wasn't diagnosed. Like I'd probably had it since I was 5 and didn't get diagnosed until I was 22 or 23. So like a long time of not being diagnosed. And I definitely noticed 10 days before my period, or like as I started to track my period a bit more, as in like using an app, and then it would be like, your period's 10 days away, and I'd be like, I'm not coping. And that would be like the biggest challenge, was this sort of like the time before my period suddenly having like very intensified intrusive thoughts and like just not being able to cope with them. So I say like PMS or like PMDD has definitely been like the biggest struggle that I've had in terms of my period. So more the impact that like the hormonal fluctuations have had on my mental health, as opposed to like the heaviness or like pain and things. Like that's definitely been like my experience and struggle there.
So talk a little bit more. Firstly, this is really interesting, and I'd love to unpack some of this. Talk a little bit first about the OCD, so obsessive compulsive disorder. And did you say you were first diagnosed when you were 5, or you first became aware of it when you were 5?
It first became aware of being like very anxious and very worried at that age. Like I was always worrying about something. Like the wind would whistle between like in an alley between our house and the next, and I thought our house was going to fall down, and was convinced of that. So I think, just to kind of like backtrack a bit, I think a lot of people think of obsessive compulsive disorder as, and I mean, stereotypes often exist for a reason, but that kind of like tidying, orderly, cleanliness thing. But there's lots of variations of obsessive compulsive disorder. So you have the obsession, so the thing that you're kind of worrying about, essentially, that you're obsessing over. And then there's the compulsion, so performing some sort of behavior to, I guess, protect yourself from the obsession happening. So it makes sense in terms of if people worry. So like COVID being a prime example for a lot of people struggling with OCD, of like, there's germs around, they're worried about them getting sick, someone they care about getting sick, even making a stranger sick kind of thing. So they'll compulsively like wash their hands to make sure like there's no germs on them. But obviously, how do you know when there are no germs on your hands anymore? So these compulsions can get completely out of hand and like completely debilitating. So my experience of it was having all internal like mental compulsions. So like ruminating on things, trying to make sense of like bodily sensations. So I, for most of my life up until very recently, mistook a wave of anxiety as like a gut feeling. So I would have some like awful thought about something and have this wave of anxiety and be like, oh my goodness, it must mean that's true. So I had it about relationships, I had it about my sexuality. Like OCD the obsessions tend to like pinpoint around things that you either really, really care about or things that you find repulsive, abhorrent. So like it often comes up around like quite taboo subjects. So people find it very difficult to talk about. So, I mean, I was a child when I had some obsessions about like it will come up about things that are in the news. So thinking about like, I mean, be really frank about it. Like I first came aware of paedophiles because of school and being like, watch out on the internet, be safe on the internet. And then I was like, am I a paedophile? And it's like, I was a child then, but like getting these thoughts in your head and just going around and round and round and round and round. And because I had like no external compulsions, no one spotted it as OCD for like over 20 years. So it was completely debilitating and has been very debilitating. Even like I had a really bad episode a few months ago, which like really took me by surprise. And like we actually had this interview that you reached out to like do this interview, and I was like, I actually can't at this point, because I was like in the midst of this like episode that I hadn't had one like that since I was like 19. So it was like quite scary. And that has very much been in line with my menstrual cycle as to when I'll have these episodes and when they'll start. So I have to be really conscious of like how I'm looking after myself, and like particularly coming into that luteal phase of like, okay, I know that things can kind of ramp up for me here if I've not been looking after myself. Like, what are the things I need to have in place to make sure that I don't give any like tiny amount of meaning to these thoughts, because they don't have any meaning. Like, it's so much of OCD is basically how you respond to the thoughts. It's like everyone has intrusive thoughts. Like I see it in clients when maybe they've just had a baby and then they're worried about like harming their baby in some way. Like, that's an intrusive thought. Like, we all have them. It's about how you respond to them. So that's the thing I've had to learn, is be like, just because I have these thoughts doesn't mean they mean anything. So yeah, I mean, that's kind of a bit of a background into like OCD. But yeah, in terms of then my menstrual cycles, like my first girlfriend, I would break up with her on a monthly basis. And it was like 100% OCD and completely in line with my periods. So.
Wow. So can you it sounds like you have a really good understanding of the layers of the OCD, and then how then it ties into the changes in hormones and neurotransmitters as they go up and down through the menstrual cycle. Can you just talk a little bit more about kind of hormonally? You might not be able to speak to this, but I'm just curious, hormonally, and in terms of what's going on with the neurotransmitters, what do you think primarily the issue is? Is it the drop in serotonin? Is it the drop in estrogen, which is affected then serotonin, glutamate, and acetylcholine? Like, do you know more about that kind of side of it?
Not specifically, but I can speak to it in terms of my experience with fertility awareness, because I became aware of, so I'm a fertility awareness mentor, and when I was doing my training, we had to like learn fertility awareness and use it on our own cycles. And I'd never tracked in that great amount of depth compared to when we were doing this. And my tutor looked at my charts, and it was taking me quite a while to get my head around like how to use the observations and things. So like my chart was quite sparse. There wasn't a lot of information on there. And she just looked at it and straight away went, well, you've got a 7-day luteal phase, and that should be about 12 to 14. And she's like, I'm not surprised at all that you have such a drastic drop in your mood, because your progesterone levels are just so minimal compared to what they could and should be. So I've always noticed that it was like, 10 days before my period, that I'm guessing as estrogen was starting to drop for me, that's when things would really, the intrusive thoughts would intensify. And then that makes sense again with like the serotonin drop. In terms of the other neurotransmitters, admittedly, I'm not that clued up on that element of it. But definitely, that was like a real wake-up call of her being like, well, if you can lengthen your luteal phase, I imagine your symptoms will improve quite a lot. And so we did a lot of unpicking of like, how do you improve your luteal phase? And a lot of that for me was like through diet and nutrition and like literally eating more. Like, I come from a dance background, so you can imagine the kind of messages around eating and things that you can carry from that. And like that alone was a game changer, and amongst some other things. And I've had a few cycles now where like the drop is far less, and it means obviously like you're not dreading like feeling great before like ovulation. Like, I've always felt really good kind of like just after my period and like a week after, and then being like, here we go, what's gonna happen? And it's like living like two different versions of yourself. And so I don't know if that answers your question.
The progesterone side is really interesting because that's kind of one of our feel good hormones. So, and we only make it when we ovulate. And then we have the link between progesterone and GABA, which is this neurotransmitter that we make in our brain. It's like natural Xanax. And it's interesting to me that you immediately were able to make the link between changing what you ate and then the changes in how much progesterone, because effectively this is about how much progesterone you made when you ovulate. So tell us a little bit more about what you did to increase or to support ovulation effectively.
A huge part of it was definitely looking at diet and nutrition and the amount of protein I was eating. I didn't realize all the kind of baggage I was carrying around food from being at dance school. Essentially, I thought I'd kind of gotten away quite lightly, really. My weight wasn't commented on when we were there, but there were lots of people in my year that were very actively told, like, you need to lose weight, your bum's too big, like this and that. And like, obviously you do kind of absorb that messaging, like whether it's said directly to you or not, which I definitely didn't appreciate until I was challenged on what I was eating. And I found it so confronting to be like, oh, maybe I need to eat more. And yeah, I had so much hesitation around it. And I was like, oh, I don't want to, and blah. And I learned fertility awareness with Lisa Hendricks and Jack. And she said to me, but like, if you want to feel different, then like, you might want to try basically just eating more. And I was like, oh, I don't know. Like, felt really like stressed out about it. And then I was like, okay, like, I'm not dancing anymore for work. Like, I don't need, like, no one needs to look the way that industry desires you to look, but let's just try it and see. And I just started like really thinking about my protein intake, because that was very minimal, upped that considerably, like a lot. And yeah, just sort of thinking about what I'm eating throughout a day, like what kind of snacks am I having? I'm an absolute sucker for a 4:00 chocolate break, and like just thinking like, am I actually hungry here? Like, do I need to eat something rather than being like, just need some sugar? And just trying to like address those things. And then it was a few months later, I was due on my period, and I was so confused because I did not at all feel like I was due on my period. Like, I felt really good. And I was like, okay, I think this is what she's talking about. And like, I'd put on a tiny bit of weight at the time. I was very stressed out about it. And now I'm like, well, my clothes still fit me. Yeah, I need to buy a size up pair of jeans, but I'm like, but I feel good. And like seeing that difference of like actually appreciating, oh, maybe I need to eat more to feel better, was just this like massive, like I felt like my mind had been blown a bit. And it's something that I'm really like passionate about talking to clients about, like when I teach fertility awareness, or even just with reflexology as well, of you need to make sure you're eating enough. And I'll always point people to nutritionists if they need additional support, but like seeing at least my experience and then now clients' experiences of like, I feel so different because the messaging I've been told my whole life of like, move more, eat less, isn't necessarily true of how to like feel good. And I just think, oh, it's so sad that particularly as women, we're like socialized this way to be as tiny as you possibly can be. And now I'm like, no, like, so yeah, that was like a huge part of it, like some supplementation, but like really making sure like the groundwork was there before adding supplements in. So like now I'll take magnesium, I'll take B6 in the luteal phase. Like that's kind of all I'm doing at the moment. I think I'm going to start on some Agnus castor, so Vitex, just to see how that works for me. But yeah, just
a note of caution with Agnus castor.
Yes,
you want to be really clear on when you take it in your cycle, because this is a lot of listeners will have heard of chasteberry, Agnus castor, Vitex is known by all three names, and it's like one of those supplements has herbs that's always recommended as a kind of, this will help to fix your period problem.
Yeah, like a bit of a cure-all.
Exactly, like maca. That's another one of those herbs. But you have to be really careful with maca. You have to be careful because it can be very estrogenic, and so with someone with fibroids, you don't want to be taking maca. But then with Agnus castus, you want to make sure that you're taking it typically in the second half of your cycle, just around ovulation, because it's so powerful, and you're using it to really help support ovulation and progesterone production. And I know this isn't a consultation, but I just had to add that in.
Yeah, totally.
See it recommended so often. I actually had this brand approach me saying, did I want to work with them? And I had to say no, because they included it in, and they were saying, take this all cycle long. And I was like, no, you really can't. But when it works, it can be so powerful.
Yeah, like I've heard this, and like I haven't tried it yet because of like all the kind of like caution around it. Like, again, in my training, it was like, this shouldn't be your first resort. Like, get your foundations in place, make sure you're eating enough, making sure like you've got like stress management practices in place, like look at your exercise, like looking at all these like sort of like foundational elements before being like, I'm just going to take this thing. And because like you don't want to be missing out on the other good stuff and the impacts that can have on all of the systems of your body, not just like your reproductive system.
What I think is actually a really interesting alternative to Vitex, Agnus castus, is vitamin E.
Oh,
so vitamin E is really powerful for supporting the balance between estrogen and progesterone. And I like to recommend it for clients who have issues around ovulation, where either they're not ovulating every cycle, or they're not making enough progesterone when they ovulate. And I personally think that there are fewer. It's for fat-soluble vitamins, so you need to make sure you're taking the right dosage. But it's definitely, I think it's a better alternative to Vitex, which is so stimulatory. On the brain. So that's just a kind of a few thoughts from me on that.
Learn something new every day.
But then, so just going back to your story, because I find this so fascinating that you have had these experiences, and although you often hear people talk about their stories, and they don't always talk about how they're coping with it currently. So you hear the people in this space talk about their period problems they've had in the past, but they don't talk about what's going on with them now. And I really applaud your honesty about what you went through at the end of last year, and the episode, as you called it, that you had. And I think that's really important, because with all of this, health is a journey, and things change and new things will come into play. Like, you might experience a new stressor, like COVID, for example. And it can throw. So even with mental health, it feels like it's almost like Tetris, Jenga in a way. Where you've got this tower that you've created. And everything is in nicely, it's stacked nicely. And once something can come along, like COVID, and take a few of the like blocks out, and it's teetering. And I just think it's so interesting to be able to say, okay, this is what I've done in the past, but current events have affected the way I feel now, and I need to revisit and be aware that this is an ongoing practice. And then just in terms of then layering on, you said PMS, but you've also said PMDD. How does that come into play?
With the OCD and like, so it's definitely yeah, historically, it's always been about like 10 days before my period comes that I'm like, okay, here we go. I can feel like these intrusive thoughts like creeping in, whatever they're about. Like OCD has a wonderful habit of being like a shapeshifter. So like you'll just sort of get to grips with like one obsession, then it'll just move on to something else. And you're like, great. But yeah, so about 10 days before, kind of can feel the intrusive thoughts like creeping in. And it's just basically like, I don't, it's like I don't feel as resilient to them. Like sometimes these thoughts will come up and I'll be like, yeah, I know exactly what that is. Like move on with my day, forget it even happened almost. And then there'll be other times where something will come up and it's like it's got bite to it. And you're like, oh, what's that about? And then you kind of start exploring this thought. And that's basically giving the thought meaning. And it's just so once you start doing that, it's just a slippery slope. And like as my period would then approach and like hormonally there's less and less supporting you, like that just intensifies and snowballs. And then it would get to like the point of my period and would just be a mess, really.
Yeah.
Like there's been times where like I have been so disassociated that I'm like, I couldn't tell you what was real almost. And so then it's like my period will come and it's just like this massive wave of relief of like, oh, okay, like I think this has been, and it's like every time, like if it's particularly intense, it's like I'll sometimes forget that like, okay, my hormones aren't really supporting me at this point. So my period will come and it's almost like, oh, thank God. Like, and the few days after that, like it can take a while to kind of, if you've been in that heightened state of anxiety, it can take some time for that to de-escalate. So then it's like you have those few days of bleeding and it can de-escalate and you kind of maybe calm down. And then it's like, oh, okay, get to like day like 3 or 4 and then be like, okay, I think I'm all right.
Yeah.
Maybe if there hasn't been too much of like an aftermath of whatever the OCD is like picked up, then I might be able to kind of like recover and be like, oh, okay, like, yeah, I'm good. Right, here we go. Then there's maybe like a week, 10, 12 days, and then it would like off it would go again. So like, I mean, it's not always as extreme as that. Like it can be much more, those shifts can be more subtle, like you say, depending on your Jenga tower and like what other kind of, well, how stable that is at the time, then like I'm far more able to like cope with different things. But yeah, just sometimes things can knock you a bit. And then if that like those foundations are shaky, then it can just really take hold. But something I've had to really learn is like I just have to not give these thoughts any meaning from the start. It's like as soon as you start to give them meaning, it's just so easy for it to snowball into something that, because when you're very anxious, like your rational brain isn't working in the same way. So like you can just take yourself down these roads that you think at the time are very logical, and then you can look back and be like, how on earth did I get from like A to Z in like 2 seconds? Like, because it can be fast as well. That's the thing. It can just, once it was snowballing, isn't it? Where it's like once it goes, it goes. And so
And so have you had any support from like a mental health professional to help you with like a toolbox for when these thoughts do come in?
Yeah, I've been really fortunate that I've been able to access therapy for the last 4 years. And like that has been privately. So like you have to acknowledge like the privilege there of being able to like see a private therapist for that amount of time. But that has truly been life-saving for me. And so I've had it's a type of cognitive behavioral therapy. So you often hear CBT mentioned, but the like kind of gold standard treatment for OCD is exposure response prevention therapy. So it's essentially you being exposed to the things you're obsessing about, and that is going to raise your anxiety, and then you have to sit with that discomfort and not perform your compulsions, whatever they may be. So compulsions, people perform them because they temporarily reduce that anxiety. So if you don't do the compulsion, the anxiety is going to increase for a time, and then naturally you kind of realize, oh, the bad thing hasn't happened, and then it comes down. So you're continually exposing yourself to different things, and like it's hard work. It's really hard work. And then in time you basically sort of come to realize that that particular thing isn't necessarily true, or it's not as you're making it out to be in your head. It's not unsafe, because I think that's the thing, is like people have these compulsions largely because they'll feel unsafe or uncertain or scared about something. And you learn that, okay, that thing's not going to happen. And as I said, OCD can be a real shapeshifter. It can pinpoint itself onto different things. So you have to do different exposures for different things. And it is definitely like ongoing work, at least it has been for me. So definitely like accessing therapy was like the biggest game changer. Like I actually originally came to reflexology as a way to help manage the anxiety, but I was undiagnosed at that point, and my poor mum didn't know what we were dealing with, and she'd seen a reflexologist. It had really helped her feel calmer, and I think that was kind of the approach we took for a while of like, how do we manage this? Because I don't think we really we didn't recognize it for what it was, because there definitely at the time was so little information about OCD, particularly in the way it was presenting for me. So yeah, like had support with like reflexology and like tried to do some therapy before, like counseling and things, but just was undiagnosed. So some approaches for all mental health conditions, you need to have the right therapy to make sure you're receiving the correct support.
Yeah. 2 follow-up questions off the back of that. So the first one is, you talked about these thoughts and how there's anxiety around them. Is there like a positive side of it? You know, do you have are there like any positive obsession, things that you get obsessed with, but it's like actually positive? Like maybe say the work you do, right? You get obsessed with a certain aspect of it, and that's actually quite motivating.
I guess so. I mean, it's great that there's not the same like anxiety driving it, but because I think like because I often think, gosh, if I could like use my brain in like the speed that it can perform at, like when it's obsessing in a negative way. But I guess, like I'm very interested and passionate about this work, and like I guess you could call it an obsession, that's for sure. So I think it can kind of having a mind that can be very particular, I guess, can be a really good thing. And like when you're running your own business, like you have to be like quite on top of stuff. So I guess like there are positives. It's funny, I've never actually been asked that question and given it that much thought. So it's quite funny thinking of it like that.
And then I wondered what your thoughts were on, when you hear people say, oh, like, I'm so OCD, when they talk about, like, I think of David Beckham talking about how the way he organizes his kitchen cupboards, and how the labels have to all be face forward, and how he talks about it as being part of his OCD. And, I don't know if he truly has OCD.
Yeah.
I remember that just sticking in my mind, thinking like that just felt weird as a way of talking about it. And I just wondered what your thoughts were about, the way that people talk about OCD kind of in the culture.
I mean, honestly, it drives me up the wall. Like it's so, and I get it. Like, again, talking about the stereotypes of things of like orderliness, cleanliness, and people will just go like someone will like tidy up their house and be like, oh, I'm just a bit OCD. I'm like, I think you like to live in a tidy environment, and like, that's fine. Like, great. Like, I think most of us do. But I think if people understood the distress and the destruction and how like debilitating OCD can be, I don't think people would talk about it like that. I genuinely feel like I lost my teenage years to OCD and just being anxious and like I say anxious, but like it's like a debilitating type of anxiety, but also there's so much energy behind it. And like I was really struggling when I was at dance school, but that environment weirdly, not in a positive way, but kind of like lent itself to that kind of like frantic energy, because I could just burn it off because I'd be dancing all day, and I'd stay, when I was in these like heightened states or in the midst of like very difficult episodes, I would be getting praised by the dance school for being like, oh, like you're staying, like bearing in mind I'd been there 8 until 6, I'd stay 6 until 9 and do extra classes, because I was like, I need to exhaust myself because I'm running off of adrenaline, dancing literally for about 12 hours at that point, because I was too scared to go home, because I was like, I'm gonna be obsessing and I'm just too scared to go home. I think if people understood what it was like to live like that, I just don't think people would be like, oh yeah, I'm just a bit OCD. And I'm just like, sure. Like, and that's kind of how, like, often when people say things, I don't go into it, because it's like, you don't necessarily want to pour your heart out every time of being like, this has been like the most difficult thing I've ever had to face throughout my life. And I know other people that have struggled with it, and it's just like, you just wouldn't wish it on anyone. You wouldn't wish it on your worst enemy. So for people to be like, haha, yeah, I'm just a bit OCD, I've like color coordinated my books, I'm like, okay.
Well, I really appreciate your honesty, and I think this will be really helpful for anyone listening who has either said something like that, and give them
and like
pause.
We've all done it, like I mean, a completely different thing, but when I was a teenager, everyone would be like, oh, that's so gay, and I'd say it and it's like, I'm a gay person. Like we've all done it, like we just have to learn.
Yeah, definitely. That's so retro, actually. That's so gay. That's such a retro.
I'd be like, oh, so gay. Yeah.
So let's shift gears a little bit and talk a little bit more about the work that you do, because you mentioned it as a way, as kind of an entry point to managing the anxiety around the OCD. But talk a little bit more about what reflexology actually is.
Yeah. So reflexology is a holistic therapy where it's performed. I mostly work on people's feet. So everyone's like, oh, you touch feet all day. And I'm like, yep. And I love it. So we usually perform it on the feet, the hands. You can also do it on the face and the ears. And we believe different parts of the body are mapped out in these extremities. So these little areas that you can like massage into using different techniques. So these areas we call reflexes, hence reflexology. And we believe that by working into them, we can have an impact throughout the whole body. So it's like a similar concept, it doesn't, like, the theories behind it are different, but similar concept to acupuncture in that, like, we're working on one area of body, but having an impact elsewhere. So it's like a deeply relaxing therapy. Like, that's one of the things that I think people find the most surprising about it, is that, like, you're just working on the feet and it's non-invasive. I give quite gentle treatments, and I think people are really shocked at the full body impact they can feel during the treatment and then after. Like, a lot of people feel like they get sort of like tingling or these waves like going through their body. And so it is like a real full-bodied experience, even though, like, we are just working on the feet and like the lower part of the calves. Sometimes, like, that's as much of your body as I'd be touching. And so it's deeply relaxing, like on another level, kind of relaxing. And I think that's definitely why I came to it, was to help kind of bring that anxiety down like a level or two. And the reflexologist I used to see, I would definitely feel so much better for going, but I definitely didn't fully relax, because I'd be sat up watching her being like, what are you doing? What's that? What's that bit? And I was just so fascinated by it. Like, before I tried it, I was like, that sounds like the biggest load of rubbish. Definitely not the word I used. I was just like, that can't be a thing. Like, I don't understand how that could work. Like, big eye roll, like, all right, mum, like, fine, I'll try. And came out just like, oh my goodness. Like, she knew, like I was having headaches. She asked me about my periods. She could tell I had like my hips were sore, because like I was like training a lot dancing at the time. And I was just like, I just was so shocked. I was like, I don't understand how this works. And so like it's a really great treatment, like particularly around like stress, anxiety. It's great for sleep, and then also supporting like other conditions. So the menstrual cycle, digestive issues, I've definitely seen it have very positive impacts on. And as I was sort of training in this work, my partner has endometriosis, and because I needed feet to practice on, I was always practicing on her feet. And she was like, this is making a massive difference for me. This is weird. And so the more I kind of went into it, and then discovering there's these whole areas of reflexology that are purely about fertility and supporting the menstrual cycle. And it just really sparked this passion and interest and obsession about this work. And that was how I kind of segued into the fertility awareness element of it all. But yeah, just seeing the impact that this very gentle treatment can have is just incredible. And like seeing the difference, like as with a lot of holistic treatments, it does like kind of require some consistent sessions, and like it does have an accumulative effect. So kind of the more frequently you're able to come, like the more you're going to kind of see those changes. And obviously working with the menstrual cycle, sometimes we don't see those changes until like 3 to 6 months. There's some immediate relief, definitely, with like kind of maybe the stress around it, some PMS symptoms, like a reduction in some pain, but that kind of like long-term effect we'll see later down the line. But when you get to work with clients and you see those changes, it's like, this is really cool.
Yeah. And so is it similar to, well, actually, can you differentiate between reflexology and massage? Because I know some people might think, oh, well, I can just get a really great foot massage, and isn't that the same thing? So can you just delineate the two?
So with reflexology, if you see a reflexologist, they'll be trained specifically on where these different areas are mapped, being able to tailor a treatment. So we're working into reflexes that are going to support you. So I always have a consultation with people beforehand. So like I really understand their history, what issues they've been having. And that really helps me to tailor their treatment, to also understand where they are in their menstrual cycle. So again, I can work the correct reflexes in the correct way. So we have different techniques that we use. So compared to a massage where it might just be kind of more, I just can't think of a better way of describing it, but these kind of like stroking, like rhythmic kind of movements, like there are elements of that, but we're really working like a lot with the thumbs, and like individually pressing, imagining if your thumb, trying to think how to describe this without having a visual of your thumb sort of like walking up different areas of the foot and like working into them with these tiny little sort of caterpillar steps is a way to describe it. And so by working into these individual reflexes, the other thing that would differentiate, aside from the treatment planning compared to massage to reflexology, when you're with a reflexologist, we're trained to detect where these sensitivities are. So when you're having a reflexology session, there might be certain areas where you're like, oh, that's quite sensitive. Or when you get a knot in your back, like that sensation in your foot, but on a much smaller level, or almost like there's bubble wrap under the skin. And we're working specifically into those areas where we feel those sensations, because that's where we would say there's like a blockage and we want to kind of try and ease that up a bit. And sometimes these areas, like these congested areas, are going to show up consistently. So if someone's got an ongoing condition or like health diagnosis, so say someone had like Crohn's disease, for example, like their digestive system is going to continually feel congested. If someone has endometriosis where they have endo, these reflexes are going to continually feel congested. So we want to make sure we're always working on them. But if you've got something like you've had a headache or a cold, like the reflexes, so like your fingers are your sinus reflexes, for instance, like you want to work into those, but the congestion might kind of like come and go as these things come and go, if that makes sense.
Can you do reflexology on yourself?
You definitely can, yeah. So I do a lot of workshops with people, like showing them how to do reflexology on themselves. It's great if you can get someone to do it on you. So if like I do workshops, I'll kind of sometimes encourage, like if you've got someone around, you want to do it on each other, like that can be really nice, because that way you get to switch off a bit. Because I think the magic comes from the treatments, because you are able to just fully switch off. So I really encourage clients to do like some reflexology on themselves as kind of maintenance. Like if they're really struggling with sleep, then doing some before they go to bed can be a really like nourishing and like calming way to like wind down and like prepare you for bed and things like that. And that maintenance kind of if you have digestive issues that like run with your cycle, then like working into those reflexes at different times. But I think the magic really comes when you're able to just like totally switch off, for sure. Yeah.
So there's a map of the foot, and I've seen those, and like every part of the foot is related to different parts of the body. And so I guess in theory, I guess it's like, as you say, it's like acupuncture where there are different, is it meridians?
So in acupuncture, it's meridians. There's not as much like research into reflexology, which is like such a shame. I wish there was. But there's lots of different theories. So it's kind of like one of them zone theory. So there's different zones of the body. So your big toe, if you were to kind of like run down the foot. So the big toe is like the head reflex. And that's zone 1. So going the whole way down that like inside edge of the foot is zone 1. And then with each toe, you go out a zone. And it's kind of like then going like from, if you had a line running down the center of your body, then going out the way at the zone. So like your shoulders are in zone 5. So we kind of often think, so that's like just underneath your little toe. It's like the shoulder reflex, or just underneath your little finger would be the shoulder reflex. So there's this kind of theory of zones. If there's like a blockage in that part of the zone, maybe there's going to be in like the rest of the zones. So kind of making the zones more balanced. And then there's also another theory of like, you do reflexology at the extremities. So there's lots of nerve endings in the hands and the feet. So one theory sort of being that by working into these nerve endings, we can have an impact sort of like sending these signals back up the body. So that's like another kind of theory. So it's slightly different to acupuncture. And like I say, there isn't the same amount of research into it, which is like, I love the science. So I wish there was. But that thing of, and I guess it is anecdotal evidence. We have to kind of acknowledge some of that, but seeing the difference between clients when they come in and when they come out of a session, and having had regular sessions, like I think for a lot of people, it takes experiencing reflexology to be like, oh, wow, this is great. And that definitely was my experience, because I was like, that's not a thing. And now I do it for a living. So, yeah.
So if someone has period problems, so like painful periods,
yes,
they could come to you for a series of sessions, and they would see a difference in their period pain.
Yeah, it's different for everyone. Like I say, some people get more kind of immediate relief. Some people, it can really help in the kind of the longer term, or help with the symptoms like around their cycle that they get as well. So I really like to see people thinking of that kind of supporting people through all stages of their cycle. I really like to see people ideally once before they ovulate and once after, and or depending on when they get their symptoms. So if people find like they start to get pain a few days before their period, or like they know their period's due, I'm like, okay, I'd like to see you a few days before that to kind of, let's keep this at bay. Let's keep everything nice and calm, and like stop anything like flaring up too much. Like we know about like stress and inflammation on the body and all those things. So like if we can keep that calmer, then like that's going to have a really positive impact. Or someone who has an experience like myself, for instance, of knowing their mood really dips, I'll be like, okay, I'd try and come a few days before. That happens if you're tracking your cycle. Let's get you in a few days before that, and then maybe like a week or so later to kind of really keep this calm. So it depends. Treatment plans depend for different things, but yeah, before and after ovulation is a good way to start having regular sessions. And then pinpointing depending on the issue, so like whether that's pain, pinpointing the treatments around when you experience that, mood changes, pinpointing when you experience those changes.
Okay. So if someone's listening and they're thinking, I need some of that, how can they get in touch with you? How can they book in for a few sessions with you?
So you can go to my website, which is www.reflexeast.com. I'm also, under Reflex East most of the time. So you can book in there, or find me on Instagram, which is just Reflex East. And there's all the booking links there. So feel free to DM me and have a chat about it if like you want to discuss anything beforehand. My DMs are always open, but otherwise, you can just book in like that.
Great. You've shared a lot of your story. You've been really open about your experience, which I think is amazing. And I know that will be really helpful for a lot of people listening. What's the one thought that you would love to leave listeners with today?
I think just really understanding your cycle gives you so much insight into like how to look after yourself. I think so often we're used to just sort of like running around and like ignoring the things that our body is telling us. And it's like tracking your cycle, understanding when symptoms, whatever they may be, come up, and just like really listening to those and being like, okay, what can I take from this that's going to like positively support me? I think that understanding is just invaluable.
Amazing. Thank you so much for coming on the show today. I so appreciate your openness and your honesty. Thank you again.
No, thank you. I'm really happy to be here. Thanks for this.
For more inspiring conversations, head over to periodstorypod.com, where we have so many more for you to peruse. If you want help with your menstrual or hormone health, email me on hello@eatlovemove.com to set up a free 30-minute hormone health review. If you like today's show, please don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review wherever you get your podcasts. Tag us, come say hi, and send in your requests for who you'd like to see on the show on Instagram and Twitter on @periodstorypod, or email us at hello@periodstorypod.com. I'm Lenise Brothers, and you've been listening to Period Story. Thank you so much for listening.